The Invisible Man, the Serum. The clock struck 11 as a brisk December wind rattled the windows of H.G. Wells's modest study in Woking. The room was a sanctuary of organised chaos, shelves sagging with books on evolutionary biology, political theory, and speculative sciences, their spines well worn from countless nights of intellectual inquiry. A gas lamp cast its glow on Wells's cluttered desk, where a half-finished manuscript lay beneath his ink-stained fingers. His brow furrowed as he reread a paragraph dissatisfied. He leaned back in his chair, gazing at the ceiling. Despite his illustrious literary record, he now found himself grappling with an unwelcome foe: writer's block. How ironic, he thought with a sardonic chuckle. At least I haven't lost my sense of humour. His mind wandered to the diary full of notes and half-formed ideas resting in a drawer. Though rich with potential, none of them had ignited the passion he sought. What he longed for was a project that could challenge the contemporary sciences, question metaphysics, and stretch the boundaries of imagination. Something groundbreaking, something that might even earn him an honorary fellowship in the Royal Society, a prestigious accolade that, while rare for a non-scientist, had been bestowed upon visionaries who advanced the sciences through other means. That recognition would solidify his place, not just as a storyteller but as a thinker of substance. A sharp rap on the door broke his reverie. Visitors at such an hour were unusual, particularly given the recent snowstorm that had left the streets silent and treacherous. Wells rose, pulling his woolen robe tighter against the draught, and made his way to the door. There stood a man, tall and thin, with the dishevelled air of one who had travelled far and in haste. He wore a heavy overcoat, its edges dusted with snow, and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured his features. A pair of intense blue eyes regarded Wells from beneath the brim, their gaze piercing yet weary. "Mr. Herbert George Wells, I presume?" the man inquired, his voice low and gravelly. Wells nodded, curiosity tinged with caution. "I am. And you are?" The man stepped forward, his gloved hand extended. "Dr. Griffin, a scientist. I require your assistance." Wells hesitated, but shook his hand, noting the strength of the grip. "Assistance with what, exactly?" "You'll forgive me if I find this visit rather unconventional." Griffin stepped inside, shedding his hat and coat to reveal a gaunt, pale face framed by unruly hair. His high cheekbones and sunken eyes gave him the appearance of one who had been consumed by his work. "I've followed your writings," Griffin began, his tone urgent. "Your explorations into the implications of scientific advancement and the ethical boundaries we so often cross. Your mind, Mr. Wells, is one of the few I believe capable of understanding my work, my discovery." Wells gestured toward the sitting room, where a fire crackled invitingly. "Come in, then. You look as though you could use some warmth. We'll talk." As Griffin settled into a worn armchair, Wells poured 2 glasses of brandy and sat opposite him. "Now, Dr. Griffin, what brings you to my doorstep on a night such as this?" Griffin took a slow sip of his drink before answering, his hands trembling slightly. "What I am about to share with you is confidential. It is revolutionary, but it is also dangerous." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I have discovered a method to render living tissue invisible. A serum derived from monocaine. It influences the refractive index of the body's tissues. Normally our bodies are visible because they reflect and absorb light in various ways," Griffin explained. "Monocaine reduces the refractive index of all substances, both inert and within living tissue. It is altered so light can pass through without being reflected or absorbed, rendering the item or person invisible." Wells, captivated by the scientific possibilities, agrees to hear him out, setting the stage for a partnership fraught with tension and promise. Wells's eyebrows shot up, his skepticism evident. "Invisible? That's quite the claim. You understand the implications of such a statement, I hope." Griffin reached into his worn leather satchel. From it he extracted a bundle of documents, which he handed to Wells. "These," he said, "are letters of reference from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Thomas Edison. Both vouch for my character and my scientific rigour. I have studied at the most esteemed institutions, Oxford, Heidelberg, and my research has been published in journals across Europe. I do not make this claim lightly, Mr. Wells." Wells thumbed through the papers, his expression shifting from scepticism to intrigue. The names and endorsements were genuine, their words glowing with respect for Griffin's intellect and innovation. Yet beneath the surface, there was an undercurrent of caution, as if they too had glimpsed the darker edges of his ambition. And why not publish your findings yourself? Surely a scientist of your caliber is more than capable, Wells said, his curiosity now fully engaged. Griffin's expression darkened. You think I haven't tried? I am pursued, Mr. Wells, ridiculed. My peers dismissed me as a madman, and my finances have dwindled to nothing. I cannot afford to continue my experiments, much less present them to a world that would rather sneer than listen. There was a long silence as Wells weighed his options. The story Griffin promised was undoubtedly extraordinary, but there was something unnerving about the man, an undercurrent of desperation and a shadow of something darker. And what do you propose, Dr. Griffin? Wells asked at last. Griffin straightened in his chair, his demeanour regaining some composure. I propose that we work together. I will provide the science, you will provide the words. Together we can immortalise this discovery. But I must warn you, this is not without risk. There are forces at play, both within and beyond my control. Wells leaned back, his curiosity piqued despite his better judgment. You've certainly intrigued me. But if we are to proceed, I'll need to see proof of your claims. A demonstration, perhaps. Griffin's smile returned, this time more genuine. Oh, you shall have your proof, Mr. Wells, and when you see it you will understand why I came to you. The firelight flickered across Griffin's face as he spoke, casting eerie shadows that seemed to echo the weight of his words. Wells nodded slowly, sensing that his life was about to take a turn he could neither predict nor control. Very well, he said, raising his glass. To discovery. Griffin raised his own glass, his smile widening. To discovery and all its consequences. Wells's basement laboratory. The alchemy of collaboration. The space that would serve as their laboratory was a chaotic repository of odds and ends. Wells had accumulated everything from broken typewriters to dusty astronomical models, a reflection of his restless curiosity. Griffin surveyed the clutter with a disdainful eye, pushing up the round spectacles that perched on his nose. This is what you call a workspace? Griffin asked, his voice sharp. Wells shrugged, unfazed. An attic would have been worse. Besides, necessity is the mother of invention, is it not? Griffin snorted but didn't argue. Instead, he unrolled a series of detailed blueprints across the rickety work table. The diagrams depicted elaborate contraptions, chemical processes and formulae written in a meticulous hand. Wells leaned over, his interest piqued. Remarkable, he murmured, tracing a line with his finger. But tell me, Dr. Griffin, how do you plan to fund all of this? These instruments are not exactly sold on street corners. Griffin hesitated, his expression tightening. Before he could respond, the sound of a woman's voice drifted down the stairs. Herbert, are you hiding down here? Both men turned as Violet Cunningham descended, her bright green dress a stark contrast to the dim and dusty surroundings. She carried a small stack of books, her smile radiating effortless charm. Ah, Violet, Wells said, stepping forward. What brings you to my humble abode today? Returning these, she said, depositing the books on a shelf. Though I must say, Herbert, your taste in reading material is rather bleak. Does every story need to involve an apocalyptic future? Wells chuckled. Not every story, just the memorable ones. Her eyes shifted to Griffin, her curiosity evident. And who might this be? Griffin straightened, his posture stiff, but his voice smooth. Dr. Jack Griffin, I'm an associate of Mr. Wells. Associate? She echoed, arching an eyebrow. Intriguing. What kind of business are you two cooking up in this dungeon? Griffin glanced at Wells, silently asking how much to reveal. Wells, ever the showman, gestured toward the blueprints. Jack here is working on something revolutionary, a scientific endeavour that could redefine the boundaries of human understanding. And you're helping him? Violet asked, her tone half teasing, half serious. Providing space, perspective, and perhaps a touch of literary flair, Wells replied with a grin. Griffin frowned. It's more than that. This project demands precision, discipline, and resources. Substantial resources. Violet's gaze lingered on the blueprints, her playful demeanour giving way to genuine interest. And what precisely are you trying to achieve? Dr. Griffin hesitated again, weighing his words. The mastery of optics, to bend light itself to our will. Violet's eyes widened. You mean invisibility? Griffin's lips curved into a faint smile. Precisely. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Then Violet laughed, a melodic sound that cut through the tension. Well, I'm no scientist, but I know ambition when I see it. And I do love a good challenge, she said, her tone shifting. If you'll have me, I'd like to help. Griffin's initial reaction was dismissive, his patriarchal tendencies surfacing. This is not a game, Miss Cunningham. This work requires more than idle curiosity. And I suppose your scientific apparatus will materialize out of thin air, she countered, her smile disarming, but her words pointed. Or perhaps you were planning to melt down Herbert's typewriter collection. Wells stifled a laugh, thoroughly enjoying the exchange. Griffin, however, was less amused. Science is not funded by charm, he retorted. No, but it often is by wealth, she shot back, and I happen to have a surplus of that. Griffin's eyes narrowed. He glanced at Wells, who gave a subtle nod. As much as Griffin disliked the idea of relying on anyone, especially a woman whose motives he couldn't fully trust, the reality of his financial constraints was undeniable. Very well, Griffin said reluctantly. But understand this. If you're in, you're all in. This is no place for half measures. Dr. Griffin, I assure you, Violet said, her voice steady. I never do anything by half. The pact is sealed. As the three of them began to clear the basement and sketch out plans, the dynamics of their partnership began to take shape. Wells acted as the mediator, his genial nature smoothing over Griffin's brusqueness. Violet brought a sharp intellect and an unexpected knack for logistics, identifying gaps in their setup and offering practical solutions. Griffin, for his part, was a begrudging but brilliant leader, his mind laser-focused on the end goal. Yet beneath the surface, tension simmered. Griffin's dismissive attitude toward Violet clashed with her refusal to be sidelined. Wells, meanwhile, couldn't ignore the undercurrent of attraction that seemed to spark between his two companions, even as it was masked by barbed exchanges. And all the while, the blueprints lay before them, a tantalizing promise of power and peril. The lab, frustration and friction. The basement laboratory was no longer merely cluttered. It had transformed into a chaotic war zone of failed experiments. Glass beakers, their contents now congealed and useless, littered the workbenches. The air was thick with the acrid stench of chemicals and the tension between its occupants. Griffin stood near the centre of the room, his face flushed with irritation as he scribbled furiously in his notebook. Wells, slouched in a chair nearby, massaged his temples while Violet meticulously cleaned a delicate piece of equipment. Damn it, Wells, Griffin snapped, slamming his pen down. You're supposed to be assisting, not lamenting our failures. And you, Wells shot back, sitting up, seem to think barking orders is synonymous with leadership. Enough, Violet interjected, her tone cool but firm. This bickering isn't helping anyone. We've been at this for days without proper rest. Perhaps a change of scenery would do us good. Griffin gave her a withering look. A change of scenery? What do you propose, a countryside picnic? Wells, sensing an opportunity to restore some levity, clapped his hands. Not a bad idea, Jack. Except I was thinking more along the lines of the village pub. A pint of ale, some fortified wine, and maybe the warmth of a fire. What say you both? Griffin's initial scowl deepened, but Violet's approving nod seemed to sway him. Fine, he muttered, but don't expect me to enjoy it. The pub, an unwelcome audience. The journey to the pub was uneventful but eerily quiet. As they entered the dimly lit establishment, the scent of stale beer and tobacco assaulted their senses. The patrons were a motley group, rough-looking men nursing drinks, their eyes narrowing as they took in the trio of outsiders. Not our usual haunt, eh? Wells whispered with a grin, trying to diffuse the awkwardness. They found a corner table, ordering drinks and settling in. For a while, the warmth of the fire and the buzz of alcohol worked their magic. The trio began to talk more freely, laughing at Wells's anecdotes and even eliciting a reluctant chuckle from Griffin. but Violet couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Across the room, two men, both wiry and rough-hewn, were openly staring at them. One toyed with a cutthroat razor, while the other leaned back, a sinister smirk playing on his lips. "Gentlemen," Violet said quietly, "I believe we're attracting unwanted attention." Wells followed her gaze but waved dismissively. "Just locals. They'll lose interest soon enough." Griffin, oblivious, downed the remainder of his drink. "Let them stare," he growled. "They're beneath our notice." Still, Violet's unease lingered. The ambush. The walk to Wells's car was brisk, the chill of the evening biting through their coats. The moon cast long shadows across the empty road, and the distant hoot of an owl was the only sound. Suddenly, two figures emerged from the darkness, blocking their path. It was the men from the pub. "Well, well," said the taller of the two, his voice thick with menace. "What's a posh lot like you doing out here so late?" "Stand aside," Griffin demanded, stepping forward. "We've no time for your nonsense." The shorter man chuckled, his cutthroat razor glinting in the moonlight. "Not so fast, mate. We're just looking for a bit of fun, and of course to lighten your wallets." Before anyone could react, the taller man lunged, landing a brutal punch to Griffin's face. He crumpled to the ground with a groan. "You'll regret that," Wells said, stepping forward with surprising resolve. The taller man swung again, but Wells dodged, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting until the revolver he held clattered to the ground. Wells followed up with a punch to the jaw that sent his attacker reeling. Meanwhile, Violet faced the razor-wielding thug. He lunged at her, but she sidestepped with a dancer's grace, her movements fluid and deliberate. Seizing his wrist, she delivered a devastating strike to his nose, the sickening crunch echoing in the night. He screamed, but Violet wasn't finished. A swift kick to his knee brought him to the ground, where she delivered a final bone-crushing blow to his ribs. The two men lay groaning in the dirt as Violet and Wells helped Griffin to his feet. They quickly returned to the pub. The landlord allowed them to use the telephone to summon the local constable. A report was made, and the attackers were soon apprehended and taken to the village lockup. Back at the house, the humiliation. "Well," Wells said, setting a glass of brandy in front of Griffin, who was nursing a swollen cheek. "Not exactly the relaxing evening I had in mind." Violet, seemingly unfazed, examined her bruised knuckles. "Perhaps next time we'll stay in." Griffin said nothing, his humiliation palpable. He stared into the fire, his mind racing with thoughts he dared not voice. But the seeds of resentment had been planted, and in the flickering light, his expression darkened. Progress, experiments, and consequences. The aftermath of the pub attack lingered in the atmosphere of Wells's home. Though outwardly the trio seemed to have moved past the incident, the underlying tension was undeniable. Griffin's bruised face was a daily reminder of his humiliation, and his determination to prove his genius seemed to burn brighter and more dangerously than ever. Empirical research, failures and frustrations. The experiments resumed with a renewed vigour that bordered on desperation. Griffin's initial focus shifted from theory to rapid, risky trials. Inanimate objects became his primary subjects. The first experiment involved a simple pocket watch. Griffin injected the serum into the mechanism, hoping to observe its effects on non-biological material. At first it shimmered under the laboratory lights, then faded, becoming entirely invisible. The triumph was short-lived. A minute later, the watch disintegrated into a fine metallic dust. Griffin scowled and recorded the outcome, muttering about structural instability. Next was a beaker filled with water. When subjected to the serum, it seemed to vanish, leaving the beaker's outline eerily visible. However, when Wells reached out to touch it, the beaker crumbled in his hands, cutting his fingers. Violet quickly bandaged the wounds, shooting Griffin a sharp look. He dismissed her concern with a wave, insisting they were on the verge of something monumental. The third failure was more alarming. Griffin treated a length of rope, intending to test its tensile strength post-transformation. The rope vanished as planned but reappeared moments later, writhing unnaturally as if alive. It twisted and snapped with violent force, nearly striking Wells. Violet grabbed a nearby knife and severed the animated section, which dissolved into ash. The incident left them all shaken, but Griffin refused to stop. Twisted and broken, the first living subject. "We need something alive," Griffin declared one evening, his tone brooking no argument. "Something with biological complexity." Wells hesitated. "Jack, this is uncharted territory. An animal. It's unethical and—" "Science is built on risks," Griffin snapped, "and sacrifices." Violet's gaze flickered between them. "What do you propose?" Griffin retrieved a small cage from under the workbench. Inside was a mouse, its tiny body quivering as it sniffed the air. "We begin with this." The serum was prepared meticulously, the lab falling into a tense silence. Griffin injected the mouse, and they watched as its form shimmered and gradually faded from sight. For a moment, it seemed a success. They could hear the creature moving, its tiny squeaks echoing eerily. Then the screams began. The mouse's squeaks turned into horrifying shrieks. Its invisible body thrashed violently, slamming against the sides of the cage. Blood spattered the interior, seemingly appearing from nowhere. Wells recoiled, horrified. Violet's hand flew to her mouth, but she forced herself to watch. Griffin stood frozen, his face pale, but his eyes wide with an unsettling mix of fascination and fear. The mouse's cries ceased abruptly, leaving only a chilling silence. When its body reappeared moments later, it was twisted and broken, its eyes bulging unnaturally. Wells turned away, retching. "A setback," Griffin murmured, though his trembling hands betrayed him. "A man's best friend, Buster." Despite the horror of the mouse experiment, Griffin was undeterred. Days later, he made his most controversial decision yet. Late one evening, while Wells and Violet were out, he turned his attention to Wells's beloved dog, Buster. The loyal terrier often lounged in the lab, oblivious to the grim work happening around him. Griffin lured the dog with soft words and treats, injecting the serum before he could reconsider. At first, the results were promising. Buster vanished seamlessly, his wagging tail the last to disappear. Griffin watched in triumph as invisible paw prints padded around the room. Then the barking began. Wild, panicked, and pained. Objects clattered as the unseen dog thrashed about. Griffin's smug expression faltered as a sickening, wet-tearing sound filled the lab. The barking ceased, replaced by a gurgling whine. When Buster's body reappeared, it was grotesquely deformed. His fur was singed, his limbs twisted at unnatural angles. Blood pooled beneath him, dark and viscous. Griffin stared in horror, his breath coming in shallow gasps. For the first time, he felt the weight of what he had done. When Wells returned and found Buster's lifeless body, the eruption was immediate. You murdered him!" Wells shouted, his voice cracking with grief. "You had no right!" "It was necessary!" Griffin yelled back, though his voice lacked conviction. "For the sake of progress. Progress." Wells advanced on him, fists clenched. "You're a madman. This ends now." Before the confrontation could escalate further, Violet stepped between them. "Stop this," she commanded, her voice sharp. "Fighting won't undo what's happened." She turned to Wells, her expression softening. "I'll ensure Griffin doesn't act without our consent again. But stopping now would mean Buster's death was in vain." Wells's shoulders sagged, his grief overwhelming him. He stormed out of the lab, leaving Violet and Griffin alone. Violet knelt by Buster's body, her face unreadable. After a moment of heavy silence, she said, "Jack, find a shovel and bury him deep in the garden's woodland. Use lime to accelerate decomposition. Mark the spot. Wells will want to visit to make his peace." Griffin blinked, caught off guard by her calm, measured tone. "And then?" he asked hesitantly. Violet's gaze turned steely. "And then get back to work. We need to fix the problem of instability during transmogrification of the tissue and organs. The molecular reassembly is still too random." She rose gracefully, brushing her hands off as though to dismiss the grim task. "I'll go and work on Wells. We can't afford for this to fall apart." Griffin nodded slowly, his expression hardening as Violet left the room. Alone with Buster's broken body, he felt the crushing weight of both his ambition and his failure, but he pushed it aside. There was still work to be done. unrelenting, the brink of discovery. The days following Buster's burial were marked by a strained silence in Wells's home. Grief hung in the air like a tangible fog, but Violet's unrelenting composure and Griffin's obsessive determination ensured the experiments continued. Wells, though deeply resentful, found himself drawn back to the lab, not out of loyalty to Griffin or Violet, but driven by a morbid curiosity and an unwillingness to leave the research entirely in their hands. Manipulation, a tenuous alliance. Violet played the role of mediator and manipulator with precision. She spent her mornings soothing Wells, gently encouraging him to see the larger picture. Jack overstepped, she admitted, her tone contrite. But science often comes with sacrifice. If we succeed, think of the lives we could save, the boundaries we could break. Wouldn't Buster's death have meaning then? Wells's grief was a gaping wound, but Violet's words, coupled with her unwavering confidence, planted a seed of doubt. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps he owed it to Buster to ensure his death wasn't meaningless. Meanwhile, Griffin buried himself in his notes, feverishly analysing every variable of the serum's failures. The problem lay in the molecular reassembly process. The serum could deconstruct matter effectively, but struggled to reconstruct it with precision. Without stability, the results would always be catastrophic. "We need a stabilising agent," Griffin muttered one evening, pacing the lab. "Something to anchor the molecular structure during reassembly." Violet, seated elegantly by the workbench, watched him with a mix of amusement and intrigue. What about protein chains? Could they act as a scaffold? Griffin paused, considering. It's possible. It would require precise calibration. He trailed off, lost in thought. "Let's test it," she urged, her voice low and persuasive. "If it works, we're one step closer. If it doesn't, we've lost nothing." Wells, lingering in the doorway, reluctantly stepped forward. "And if it fails catastrophically again?" Griffin shot him a glare, but Violet intervened smoothly. "That's why we'll be meticulous. No risks like last time." Her eyes locked with Wells's. "You can oversee everything. Make sure Jack doesn't overstep." It was a calculated move, and Wells knew it, but it was also a lifeline, a way to regain some control over the situation. He nodded curtly, and the fragile alliance was restored. The breakthrough. No blood. Under Wells's watchful eye, the trio refined the serum. Days turned into weeks, marked by countless tests and adjustments. Small victories buoyed their spirits. Inanimate objects retained their structure post-transformation, and the rope's violent reanimation was no longer an issue. Finally, Griffin declared the serum ready for another test on a living subject. This time, the trio was unified in their approach. "A rabbit," Wells insisted. "Nothing larger." Griffin grudgingly agreed, and Violet procured a white rabbit from a nearby farm. The animal sat placidly in its cage, its nose twitching as the trio prepared the serum. The injection was administered with care. The rabbit's form shimmered and faded, just as Buster's had. For a moment there was only silence. Then soft thumps as the invisible creature moved within the cage. The trio held their breath. When the rabbit reappeared, it was intact. No blood, no deformities. Its white fur was pristine, and its dark eyes stared back at them, wide but unafraid. "It worked," Violet whispered, her voice tinged with awe. Griffin's laugh was sharp and triumphant. "I told you, we're on the cusp of something extraordinary." Wells, though cautiously optimistic, couldn't suppress a small smile. For the first time since Buster's death, hope flickered within him. Unforeseen complications. Rejection. But the celebration was short-lived. Within an hour, the rabbit began to show signs of distress. It scratched at its cage, its movements erratic. Patches of fur fell away, revealing raw, irritated skin beneath. Its breathing became laboured. Griffin's triumph turned to panic as he scrambled to take notes. It's an immune response," he stammered. "The body's rejecting the transformation." Wells's earlier optimism hardened into anger. "You said it was ready. This is Buster all over again." "No," Griffin snapped. "This is progress. We're closer than ever. We just need more time." Violet stepped in once again, her voice cutting through the tension. "Enough! We'll isolate the variables and fix this, but you both need to stay focused." The rabbit's suffering ended swiftly, but the weight of its loss lingered. For Wells, it was another crack in his resolve. For Griffin, it was fuel for his obsession. And for Violet, it was an opportunity to solidify her control over the experiment and the men. Violet, a quiet revelation. That night, while Griffin pored over his notes and Wells retreated to his study, Violet sat alone in the lab. She stared at the remaining serum, its translucent shimmer catching the dim light. Slowly a smile curved her lips. "We're closer than you think," she murmured to herself. And in the quiet, she began to plan. Denial, the price of obsession. The days following Buster's death passed in a strained and heavy silence. Wells avoided the lab entirely, his grief manifesting in long walks through the wooded garden where Griffin had buried the dog. Violet remained a steady presence, moving between Wells and the lab with a practiced ease that masked her deeper intentions. Griffin, on the other hand, threw himself into his work with a manic fervour, his guilt buried beneath layers of determination and denial. Resilience, refinements and reluctance. Griffin's approach to the serum shifted after the failures. He took meticulous notes, refining the molecular structure and tweaking the dosage. The instability that plagued living subjects became his primary focus, and Violet's observations often provided invaluable insights. "The cellular reassembly isn't aligning correctly," she noted one evening, her finger tracing a diagram on Griffin's notepad. "It's as if the serum's properties disrupt the body's natural order." Griffin nodded, his jaw tight. "It's the tissue's resilience. Living matter resists the transformation. I'll need to adjust the stabilizing agent." "And add a buffer to control the molecular decay," Violet suggested. Griffin paused, glancing at her with a rare flicker of appreciation. "You're sharper than I gave you credit for." Her smile was faint, but calculating. "You'll find I'm full of surprises, Jack." As the serum underwent incremental improvements, Wells's reluctance to return to the experiments waned under Violet's careful persuasion. She approached him one evening in his study, where he sat staring at Buster's collar resting on the desk. "Herbert," she began gently, her voice soft but insistent, "I know you're hurting, but Griffin needs your guidance. You're the voice of reason in this madness. Without you, who knows what he might do next?" Wells's eyes, red-rimmed from sleepless nights, met hers. "I'm not sure I can forgive him." "You don't have to," she replied. "But if you let this project spiral out of control, Buster's death truly will be meaningless. Help us finish this, safely." After a long silence, Wells exhaled deeply. "I'll consider it." A dangerous proposal. What's the subject? Griffin's latest breakthrough came late one night. Wells and Violet found him in the lab, surrounded by papers and empty coffee cups, his eyes alight with triumph. "It's ready," he announced, holding up a vial of the revised serum. "I've solved the instability issue. The next test will succeed." Wells frowned. "What's the subject?" Griffin hesitated, then straightened. "Me." "Absolutely not." Wells exploded. "After everything that's happened, you want to risk your own life." "It's the logical next step," Griffin argued. "No more animals, no more guesswork. If we're to prove this works, it has to be a human subject." Violet's gaze sharpened, but her voice remained calm. "Jack, even if the serum is stable, we don't know the long-term effects." Griffin's expression hardened. "We've come too far to stop now. The risks are mine to take." "This isn't just about you," Wells shouted, his face flushed with anger. "If something goes wrong, it'll destroy all of us." For a moment, the lab was silent, the tension crackling like static. Then Violet stepped forward, placing a hand on Griffin's arm. "Perhaps there's a compromise," she said, her tone measured. "We test on a human subject, but not you." Griffin's brows furrowed. "Who then?" Her smile was faint, enigmatic. "Leave that to me." The Edward experiment, dear God. The laboratory was cold that night, the dim gaslight flickering against the walls as shadows danced over the shelves of chemicals and tools. Edward shuffled in, his thin coat doing little to protect him from the chill. His face was gaunt, the hollows beneath his eyes a testament to long nights spent on the streets. Griffin greeted him with a broad, almost welcoming smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Edward, my good man," he said, clasping his hands together. "Thank you for coming." Edward looked around nervously. "You said this was safe?" he asked, his voice wavering. "Perfectly safe," Griffin lied smoothly, his tone dripping with reassurance. "We're simply testing a tonic, nothing more. It's all very scientific, you see, and the payment we discussed will be yours regardless." Edward's shoulders relaxed marginally, though his eyes darted to the hulking silhouette of Wells in the corner. Violet, poised at the edge of the room with a notebook in hand, offered him a faint smile, though her gaze was inscrutable. "Shall we begin?" Griffin gestured to the chair in the centre of the room. It was a heavy, almost throne-like contraption, fitted with leather straps and steel armrests. Edward hesitated, his instincts urging him to leave, but the promise of money was too tempting. With a reluctant nod, he sat down. Wells moved forward, his face etched with unease. "This is madness, Griffin," he whispered. "We don't even know what this serum will do to a human body." Griffin waved him off, his expression hardening. "Science demands risks, Herbert. We've prepared as best we can. Now step aside and let me work." The serum shimmered faintly in the glass syringe, its colour shifting between iridescent hues. Griffin held it up to the light, his eyes alight with anticipation. "This," he declared, "is the culmination of our efforts, a few moments of discomfort for a lifetime of discovery." Edward's eyes widened as Griffin approached, but before he could protest, the needle sank into his arm. The plunger depressed slowly, the liquid seeping into his veins. At first there was silence. Then Edward's breathing grew laboured, his chest heaving as beads of sweat formed on his brow. What's happening?" he gasped, his voice strangled. His body jerked violently, his back arching against the chair as a guttural scream tore from his throat. Wells stepped forward instinctively, but Griffin held him back. "No, this is it. The reaction!" Edward's skin began to change, his flesh rippling as if something beneath it was struggling to escape. His arms and legs contorted grotesquely, veins bulging and blackening. His skin shimmered, flickering between translucence and grotesque visibility, as though his body was waging war against the serum's effects. "Griffin, stop this!" Wells bellowed, grabbing at the straps that bound Edward to the chair. "It's too late!" Griffin shouted back, his voice filled with a mix of awe and frustration. "We're seeing history unfold." Edward's screams grew fainter, his movements weakening until he collapsed, his head lolling to one side. His lifeless eyes stared into the distance, wide with terror. The silence that followed was deafening. Wells stumbled back, his face pale and his hands trembling. "Dear God," he whispered, staring at the broken figure before them. "What have we done?" Griffin, on the other hand, leaned in closer, inspecting Edward's body with a detached curiosity. "Fascinating," he muttered, brushing a hand over the man's translucent, bloodied skin. "The serum clearly needs adjustment, but the potential is undeniable." "Potential?" Wells rounded on him, his voice shaking with fury. "You call this potential? He's dead, Griffin. We killed him." "It's a sacrifice for progress," Violet said calmly, though her expression betrayed a flicker of unease. She closed her notebook and looked directly at Wells. "If we're to make breakthroughs, there will be risks. You knew that when you agreed to this." Wells turned to her, disbelief etched on his face. "You're justifying this? How can you be so cold?" "I'm being realistic," Violet replied, her voice steady. "If we stop now, his death will mean nothing. But if we continue, if we perfect the serum, we can change the world." Griffin nodded, his resolve unshaken. "She's right. This is a setback, yes, but it's also a lesson. We know more now than we did before. We're closer than ever." Wells shook his head, his hands balling into fists. "You're mad, both of you." He turned and left the laboratory, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Griffin watched him go, a sneer curling his lips. "Let him sulk. He'll come around," he said, more to himself than to Violet. Violet glanced at Edward's lifeless body, her face unreadable. "We'd better clean this up," she said finally, her tone matter-of-fact. "No one can know what happened here." Griffin chuckled darkly. "Agreed. The price of progress, my dear." Together, they worked in silence, their grim task a stark reminder of the path they had chosen, and the sacrifices it demanded. Shadows of betrayal. Stay out of my way. The laboratory had become a battlefield of ideologies and desperation. While Griffin pored over his notes, refining the serum with a manic fervour, Wells and Violet exchanged furtive glances. The tension between them was palpable, an unspoken understanding of what needed to be done. Violet struck first. "Jack, you've made incredible progress, but have you considered the practical applications of invisibility? How do you plan to stabilise the process for sustained use?" Griffin didn't look up from his work. "The applications are limitless, Violet. Espionage, surveillance, even warfare. The potential outweighs the risks." Her voice softened, calculated. "But if you rush it, you might lose control. You, need to ensure it's perfect before moving forward." Wells sat in a corner, his face a mask of discomfort. "She's right, Jack. We can't afford another failure like Edward." Griffin's hand froze mid-scribble. His voice was a low growl. "Edward was a setback, not a failure. Progress demands sacrifice." "Sacrifice?" Wells stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the stone floor. "That man trusted us. He trusted you, and you turned him into a goddamned corpse." Griffin finally looked up, his eyes blazing. "Science isn't for the faint of heart, Herbert. If you can't handle the cost, then stay out of my way." The room fell into an uneasy silence. Griffin returned to his notes, muttering under his breath, while Violet placed a calming hand on Wells's arm, her expression unreadable. Divided resolve, moral cowardice. The atmosphere in Wells's study had grown tense, the camaraderie that once united the trio strained under the weight of their clashing ambitions. The evening fire crackled in the hearth, but the warmth did little to dispel the chill of their disagreement. "This serum is not ready," Wells said firmly, his tone brooking no argument. He stood by his desk, a sheaf of notes in his hand, his brow furrowed in frustration. "The results with the rabbits are inconsistent at best. Some disappear cleanly, others suffer grotesque deformities. Until we can predict the outcome with certainty, we cannot risk human trials." Griffin sat across from him, his posture rigid with barely concealed fury. "You're a fool if you think we can afford to wait," he snapped, his voice sharp as the edge of a blade. "Every day we delay is a day wasted. Do you think the world will wait for us? For you to overcome your moral cowardice?" The insult hung heavy in the air, but Wells refused to rise to the bait. He placed his notes on the desk with deliberate care, fixing Griffin with a steady gaze. "This isn't cowardice, Griffin. It's responsibility. What good is discovery if it comes at the cost of lives? We have to be methodical, precise." Violet, seated in the corner with her notebook, observed the exchange in silence. Her sharp mind worked quickly, weighing the stakes of the argument. She knew Wells's methodical approach was the safest path, but Griffin's urgency resonated with her own ambition. "Gentlemen," she interjected smoothly, her voice cutting through the tension. "We're all after the same goal, are we not? There's no need for hostility." Griffin turned to her, his eyes blazing. "Hostility? It's his dithering that's holding us back. We're on the verge of greatness, and he wants to waste time testing on rodents." Wells scoffed, but before he could respond, Violet raised a hand. "Enough, both of you." She stood, her presence commanding the room's attention. "I propose a compromise. We proceed with animal trials, as Wells suggests, but Griffin and I will work independently to accelerate our progress. Discreetly." Wells frowned, his jaw tightening. "And by discreetly, you mean behind my back," he said coldly. Violet smiled faintly, a trace of steel in her gaze. "Call it what you like, Herbert. The point is, we can't afford to let this project stagnate. You can oversee the formal experiments, ensuring the data is rigorous. Griffin and I will handle other avenues. Griffin's expression shifted, his anger giving way to a sly grin. Now you're speaking my language, he said, leaning back in his chair. Wells's disapproval was palpable, but he knew he was outmaneuvered. Violet's logic was difficult to refute, and Griffin's determination was unyielding. Sighing, he turned away, staring into the fire. If this goes wrong, I want no part of it, he said quietly. Understood, Violet replied, her tone smooth and conciliatory. Over the following weeks, the rift between them widened. Wells immersed himself in refining the serum, his focus on achieving consistent results with animal trials. He spent long hours documenting every variable, his journal filling with meticulous notes. Meanwhile, Griffin and Violet operated in the shadows. Under the cover of darkness, they procured supplies and tested new formulations of the serum. Griffin's impatience drove him to take risks, while Violet's calculated approach ensured their secrecy. One night, as Wells worked in the main laboratory, he overheard muffled voices from the adjoining room. Suspicious, he crept to the door, his heart sinking as he caught snippets of conversation. The dose needs to be higher, Griffin was saying, his voice low but intense. We're not seeing the full effect at this level. And if the subject doesn't survive? Violet asked, her tone clinical. Then we try again. Progress demands sacrifice, Violet. Wells clenched his fists, his conscience warring with his curiosity. He knew confronting them would only deepen the divide, but their recklessness terrified him. When he returned to his desk, he found himself staring at his notes, the words blurring together. The weight of the Alliance's fractures bore down on him, and for the first time, he questioned whether their endeavour was worth the cost. In the secretive experiments, Griffin's obsession grew darker. His once sharp intellect was now consumed by his drive to perfect the serum, his behaviour becoming erratic. He snapped at Violet when things went wrong, though she bore his outbursts with a cool detachment. You're losing control, she remarked one evening, her pen scratching across the pages of her notebook. I'm closer than ever, Griffin shot back, his eyes wild. Wells is the one losing control, clinging to his pathetic ethics while we forge ahead. Violet didn't argue. She recognised the danger in Griffin's dissent, but was too invested to pull away. The serum was no longer just a scientific pursuit, it was an obsession, binding them together in a fragile, volatile alliance. Griffin's dissent, manic exhilaration. The laboratory hummed softly with the sound of bubbling flasks and whirring machinery. Wells meticulously recorded data from the latest animal trials, his movements deliberate and precise. His journal was filled with observations of rabbits and rats, disappearing and reappearing, with some horrifying failures scrawled in increasingly tense handwriting. In contrast, Griffin and Violet operated in the shadows, their clandestine activities concealed from Wells's watchful eye. They worked late into the night, pushing the boundaries of their experiments. Violet, with her unyielding ambition, ensured their operations were well funded, while Griffin's obsession grew darker and more all-consuming. This serum will change the world, Griffin muttered one evening, pacing the lab with the vial in hand. But these animals, they're a waste of time. Their biology tells us nothing about the human experience. There's only one way forward. Violet watched him from across the room, her sharp eyes gleaming with a mixture of fascination and concern. You mean human trials? She asked, her voice calm but edged with intrigue. Griffin stopped pacing, fixing her with a piercing gaze. Human trials, and I'll be the subject. Before Violet could respond, Griffin had already rolled up his sleeve, revealing pale, scarred skin. He sterilized the syringe with practiced precision, his hands steady despite the magnitude of his decision. Violet hesitated but didn't stop him, her curiosity overriding any sense of caution. As the needle pierced his arm, Griffin's jaw tightened. The serum burned as it entered his bloodstream, spreading like liquid fire. He clenched his fists, his body shuddering as the transformation began. Violet leaned forward, her notebook in hand. How do you feel? She asked, her tone clinical despite the spectacle unfolding before her. Griffin's veins began to shimmer, glowing faintly as if illuminated from within. His skin rippled and distorted, the flesh warping as it became translucent. It's working, he gasped, his voice hoarse with pain. The process was excruciating, his muscles contorted, spasming violently as his body flickered between visibility and nothingness. Violet noted the changes with a detached curiosity, scribbling feverishly even as Griffin let out a guttural scream. His skin faded, revealing muscles and veins beneath, before those too disappeared into the void. And then silence. Griffin collapsed to his knees, invisible save for the faint outline of his trembling form. I did it, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Violet approached cautiously, her hand hovering near where his shoulder should be. You're completely invisible, she said, awe-colouring her usually composed tone. How do you feel? Griffin laughed weakly, a sound tinged with both triumph and madness. Powerful, he murmured, but it's overwhelming. My body, it feels like it's tearing itself apart. The invisibility didn't last long. Slowly, Griffin's body reappeared, starting with faint outlines and growing into full visibility. His face was drenched in sweat, his breathing laboured. The physical toll was undeniable, but his expression was alight with manic exhilaration. This is just the beginning, he declared, his voice filled with conviction. Over the following weeks, Griffin continued to inject himself with the serum, each dose bringing new refinements and new horrors. The pain never lessened, but he bore it with grim determination. The moments of invisibility grew longer, but so too did the after-effects. His skin began to take on a sallow hue, his eyes sunken and wild. His demeanour shifted as well. Where once he had been calculated and brilliant, he now became erratic, prone to fits of paranoia and bursts of anger. He avoided Wells altogether, dismissing his cautious methods as cowardice. Wells is holding us back, Griffin snarled one night, pacing the lab with restless energy. He's too blinded by his morality to see the possibilities. Violet, ever the pragmatist, merely nodded. She documented his every word, his every action, noting the growing instability in his behaviour. But her own ambition kept her silent. Griffin's madness was a small price to pay for the knowledge they were gaining. One evening, Violet found him staring into a mirror, his reflection flickering in and out of visibility. His hands were pressed against the glass, his breath fogging the surface as he muttered to himself. "They can't see me," he whispered, a crooked grin spreading across his face. "But I see them, all of them. Vulnerable. Weak." Violet stepped closer, her voice calm but firm. "Griffin, you're pushing yourself too hard. You need to rest." He turned to her, his eyes blazing with intensity. "Rest?" "There's no time for rest, Violet. Do you think the great minds of history stopped to rest when they were on the brink of discovery?" Violet didn't respond, her gaze steady. She knew better than to argue with him in this state. Instead, she resumed her note-taking, her mind whirring with calculations and possibilities. As Griffin's transformations continued, the line between genius and madness blurred. His brilliant mind, once his greatest asset, became clouded by delusions of grandeur. His detachment from humanity grew with each passing day, leaving Violet to wonder if he was still the man she had agreed to work with, or something else entirely. The night of revenge. Who's there? Griffin sat alone in the dimly lit laboratory, the glow of the equipment casting eerie shadows across the room. The latest dose of the serum sat before him in a glass vial, its translucent contents swirling as if alive. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from anticipation. Months of frustration, ridicule, and pent-up rage boiled to the surface as he thought of the men who had humiliated him after their pleasant evening at the pub. Tonight, he would reclaim his dignity. With a swift motion, Griffin injected the serum into his arm. The familiar burn coursed through his veins, spreading like wildfire. He clenched his teeth against the pain, his muscles tightening as his body shimmered, flickered, and then disappeared entirely. For a brief moment, he stared at his reflection, or lack thereof, in the mirror. A manic grin spread across his face. "It's time," he whispered to himself, his voice tinged with both triumph and malice. Under the cover of darkness, Griffin made his way to the police station. The cool night air prickled his skin as he moved silently through the streets, his heart pounding with exhilaration. He slipped past the constable at the front desk with ease, his footsteps inaudible against the creaking wooden floor. The holding cells were dimly lit, a single flickering lamp casting long, distorted shadows. The smell of sweat and despair lingered in the air. Griffin located the two men, his attackers, sitting in adjacent cells. The larger one, a brute of a man with a face scarred from countless brawls, snored loudly, oblivious to the horror about to unfold. The other sat on the edge of his cot, muttering to himself, his hands twitching nervously. Griffin unlocked the first cell with keys he had swiped from a sleeping guard. The click of the lock startled the nervous man, who froze, his wide eyes darting around the room. "Who's there?" he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Griffin didn't answer. Instead, he slipped inside, his presence marked only by the faint rustling of his movements. The man's panic grew, his breathing shallow and rapid. I can hear you," he croaked. From the corner of the cell, Griffin whispered, his voice low and mocking. "You should never have touched me." The man screamed, scrambling to the far corner of the cell as Griffin approached. The razor appeared seemingly out of thin air, glinting malevolently in the dim light. The blade flashed once, then again, carving through flesh with precision. Blood sprayed the walls as the man's screams echoed through the station, only to be cut short by a final, brutal slice. In the adjacent cell, the second thug awoke with a start. He stared in horror as his companion's lifeless body slumped to the ground, his blood pooling beneath him. "What is this? What's happening?" he screamed, gripping the bars of his cell. Griffin turned to face him, his voice a chilling whisper. "The devil has come for you." The second man cowered, his hands trembling as he muttered prayers under his breath. Griffin paused, savouring the moment. He allowed his footsteps to echo as he moved, deliberately letting the man feel the presence of an unseen predator. The terror in his eyes was almost enough to sate Griffin's thirst for revenge. Almost. Satisfied with the fear he had sown, Griffin exited the station as silently as he had entered. The night air greeted him like an old friend, cooling the adrenaline that coursed through his invisible body. As he returned to Wells's house, the effects of the serum began to fade. Slowly his limbs shimmered back into view, his skin regaining its solidity. His heart raced with exhilaration, his mind replaying the night's events in vivid detail. He laughed, a deep, unrestrained sound that echoed through the empty streets. "They'll never forget me now," he muttered to himself, his voice tinged with both satisfaction and madness. By the time he reached the house, he was fully visible again. His clothes, damp with sweat and stained with traces of blood, clung to his skin. But Griffin didn't care. For the first time in months, he felt alive, powerful, untouchable. As he entered the laboratory, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the mirror. His grin widened as he whispered to himself, "This is only the beginning." The morning sunlight filtered through the lace curtains of Wells's dining room, casting fractured patterns across the table. A kettle whistled in the background, its shrill sound cutting through the uneasy silence. Wells sat stiffly at the table, his hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. Violet perched opposite him, perfectly composed as she added a touch of cream to her cup. Griffin sauntered in last, his dishevelled appearance and barely concealed smirk setting the tone for what was to come. The newspaper lay between them, its headline screaming, "Devil's Wrath in Iping, Sussex, prisoner slaughtered in apparent supernatural attack." Below it was an artist's grim depiction of a blood-soaked cell, with one man dead and another cowering in terror. Wells's eyes darted between the paper and Griffin, his knuckles whitening as he gripped his cup. "Explain this," he demanded, his voice taut with suppressed anger. Griffin plopped into a chair, grabbing a slice of toast with infuriating nonchalance. "Explain what?" he asked, feigning innocence as he took a bite. "You know exactly what," Wells snapped, slapping the paper with the back of his hand. "This monstrosity. The reports of an invisible demon. The descriptions, they match too closely to be coincidence." Violet sipped her tea, her expression calm and detached. Perhaps it's just a case of mass hysteria, she suggested lightly. People love a good ghost story, especially when there's blood involved. Wells turned to her, his incredulous gaze barely masked. You can't seriously believe this has nothing to do with us, nothing to do with him. Griffin leaned back, folding his arms behind his head, a smirk playing on his lips. Oh, come now, Herbert. Are you really going to blame me for every ghastly headline in the paper? Perhaps there is a devil stalking the streets. Who's to say it isn't some other enterprising lunatic? Wells slammed his cup onto the table, tea sloshing over the rim. Don't play coy with me, Griffin. You've been erratic, reckless, borderline unhinged, ever since you started injecting yourself with that damned serum. And now this. What if someone saw you? What if... Griffin cut in, his voice dripping with disdain. What if someone discovers us? What if the world finds out? What if pigs start flying? You sound like a frightened old woman, Herbert. Enough. Violet's voice sliced through the rising tension, cool and commanding. She set her cup down with deliberate care, her gaze sharp as a scalpel. Both of you. The room fell into a strained silence, broken only by the faint ticking of the mantel clock. Griffin, she said evenly, turning to him, if this was your doing, you need to be honest with us. Our work, our very survival, depends on maintaining control. Recklessness puts everything at risk. Griffin met her gaze, the smirk fading slightly. For a moment it seemed as though he might concede, but then his lips curled upward again. Fine, he said, his tone mocking. Let's say I did have a bit of fun last night. A personal experiment, if you will. No harm in testing the limits of our discovery, is there? No harm? Wells's voice rose with incredulity. You butchered a man in his cell and left another raving about invisible demons. You've painted a target on all our backs. Griffin's eyes narrowed, his casual demeanour evaporating. You think I care about your moral outrage, about the judgment of a society that would tear us apart if they knew what we were capable of? This isn't about you, Herbert, it's about progress, about power. Power? Wells shot back, his voice breaking. You're mad. This isn't power, it's murder. The two men locked eyes, the air between them thick with hostility. Violet rose from her seat, stepping between them. Enough, she said again, her tone tolerating no dissent. This bickering achieves nothing. What's done is done. The question is, how do we move forward without tearing ourselves apart? Griffin snorted, leaning back in his chair. Simple. We keep going, this is merely the beginning. Wells shook his head, his expression one of weary despair. You're deluding yourself. If we continue down this path, it will destroy us all. Violet placed a hand on Wells's arm, her touch surprisingly gentle. Herbert, listen to me. We've come too far to stop now, but we can proceed cautiously, on our terms, together. Her words carried an undertone of warning directed at both men. The fragile alliance hung by a thread, and they all knew it. Griffin rose, brushing crumbs from his waistcoat. You two can debate the ethics all you like. I have work to do. As he strode out of the room, Wells buried his face in his hands, muttering to himself. Violet watched Griffin's retreating figure, her composed mask slipping for a moment to reveal a flicker of unease. The clock chimed the hour, its sound eerily cheerful against the tense silence. The morning sun continued its climb, indifferent to the shadows gathering in the minds of those at the table. The force of invisibility, refining the serum. The laboratory was a hushed sanctuary of ambition, its walls lined with flasks, tubes, and shadowed silhouettes of machinery. Violet stood at the centre of it all, her gaze fixed on a set of notes she had meticulously compiled. The faint hum of gas lanterns and the rhythmic tick of a pendulum clock served as a metronome for her thoughts. The serum was brilliant, but brilliance wasn't enough. Not yet. She needed it perfected. The grotesque transformations were a hurdle, a horrifying spectacle that would repel the very people she intended to entice. Governments, militaries, those who could truly pay for a miracle. No general would field an army of invisibles if the cost was agonizing death or soldiers collapsing in paroxysms of pain mid-mission. Her ambitions were clear. If she could refine the formula, if she could eliminate the grotesque distortions and scale production, The wealth she stood to gain would eclipse even her wildest dreams. Inheritance. That was a trifle compared to what this serum could bring. Armies would march unseen. Espionage would be revolutionized. Entire nations would bow to the force of invisibility. But there was one more piece. Griffin. Manipulating Griffin. I wouldn't dream of it. Violet moved quietly through the lab, her heels clicking softly on the polished floor. She found Griffin hunched over a table, his back rigid, muttering to himself as he scribbled chaotic notes. His gaunt frame seemed almost swallowed by his lab coat now, and his fingers were stained a ghostly hue from the chemicals he worked with. She softened her expression, adopting a gentle, almost maternal tone. Griffin, you're wearing yourself thin. You can't push forward like this without a plan. He turned, his eyes wild, bloodshot and unnervingly bright. A plan? He sneered. I've already got one. This serum is my plan. Our plan. He jabbed at his notes with a finger, the pages trembling under his touch. Don't tell me to stop. Not when I'm this close. I'm not suggesting you stop, Violet said smoothly, stepping closer. But if we're going to show the world what you've created, we need more than success. We need perfection. No deformities, no pain. You want them to see this as a gift, don't you? Not as some hideous curse. Griffin's lip curled as if to retort, but the venom faded. The logic of her words struck him somewhere beneath the surface of his mania. What are you suggesting? She leaned in, lowering her voice. We refine it, together. You focus on the chemistry and I'll handle logistics, making sure you have everything you need. But we also need to think bigger, Griffin. A proper production system, equipment that can handle scale. Think of it, an entire production line churning out your creation. Griffin's eyes narrowed as he studied her face. And why does this sound like you're angling for something? Because I am, Violet replied evenly. I believe in this project, Griffin. I believe in you. But if we're going to succeed, we need to think strategically. You've got the brilliance. Let me take care of the rest. His gaze lingered, suspicion flickering. If you try to take this from me... I wouldn't dream of it, Violet interrupted, her tone like velvet. This is your masterpiece. I'm just here to make sure the world recognizes it and pays handsomely for it. Neutralizing Wells, he needs you, and so do I. The next morning, Violet found herself in the parlour with Wells, the sunlight filtering through the lace curtains casting soft patterns across the room. Wells was pacing, his hands clasped behind his back, his brow furrowed in thought. It has to stop, Violet, he said abruptly, his voice tight with conviction. Griffin is unravelling and I fear for where this will lead. We need to take a step back. Violet tilted her head, feigning concern. I understand your worries, truly I do. But you've seen the progress we're making. The animal trials are promising and Griffin's work, while unconventional, could change everything. At what cost? Wells countered, his voice rising. We've already seen a man die horribly in our lab. We're playing God, and I don't know how much longer I can stomach it. Violet stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on his arm. That's precisely why you need to stay, Herbert, to ensure this doesn't spiral into something unthinkable. If you leave, Griffin will have no one to temper his ambition. He needs you, and so do I. Wells hesitated, his expression softening. Violet smiled inwardly, sensing his resolve faltering. Setting the stage, a little more patience. As the days wore on, Violet worked tirelessly to keep her delicate web intact. She placated Griffin with promises of glory, soothed Wells with appeals to his conscience, and continued her secretive preparations for a future without them both. Griffin's instability was becoming a liability, and she knew time was running out. The serum would be perfected. She would see to that. But once it was, Griffin's usefulness would end. And Wells. He would either fall in line or be dealt with accordingly. For Violet Cunningham, the future was hers to claim. All she needed was a little more patience. A god among mortals, the power of persuasion. Violet leaned against the edge of the workbench, her voice dripping with admiration as she addressed Griffin. You know, Griffin, I've studied with some brilliant minds in my time, but none of them even come close to you." Griffin turned from his beakers and formulas, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Flattery, Violet? Really? I don't need that." "This isn't flattery," she said, stepping closer, her tone growing earnest. "You're doing something no one else on this planet could even comprehend. Do you realize that? When the world finally sees the fruits of your work, those pompous fools who laughed at you, the so-called peers who dismissed you, they'll grovel at your feet. They'll beg for the chance to attach their names to your genius." Griffin's lips twitched into a semblance of a smile. "They should. None of them have the courage or intellect for this. They're all cowards." "Exactly," Violet said, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "And you? You're a god among mortals, Griffin. You're crafting miracles that will reshape the future. It's righteous work, and only you can do it." Griffin's chest swelled slightly, his eyes gleaming with a fervent light. "They'll see. They'll all see." Stroking Wells's conscience. The Royal Society. Later that evening, Violet found Wells seated by the fire, a glass of brandy in hand as he stared into the flames. His expression was weary, the burden of their endeavour etched into every line of his face. "You look troubled, Herbert," Violet said softly, taking a seat across from him. "It's this project," he admitted after a pause. "The cost, Violet. It's growing heavier by the day." "And yet," Violet said, a warm smile playing on her lips, "you've been the rock holding it all together. Without you, none of this would have been possible. Griffin might be brilliant, but he's uncontrollable. You've been the one to harness that brilliance and guide it." Wells shook his head. "He's beyond control. The path we're on, it's becoming too dangerous, Violet." She reached out, placing a gentle hand on his. "Herbert, history will remember you as the man who revolutionized science. When the world knows what you've accomplished here, the accolades will be endless. A knighthood, surely. Perhaps even a seat in the House of Lords." He blinked, startled by the suggestion. "Imagine it," she continued, leaning forward. "Publishers clamouring for your story, the lectures, the fellowship of the Royal Society. Your name will be spoken with reverence for generations. You'll be the man who transformed humanity's understanding of reality. Isn't that worth it?" Wells looked away, his brow furrowing as he weighed her words. "I believe in you," Violet added softly. Then, with a playful smile, she gave a small theatrical bow. "A toast to the future Lord Wells?" He chuckled despite himself, lifting his glass. "A toast to a future I'm still trying to make peace with." Moving forward. The ultimate goal. The next day, the tension between the trio seemed to ease, lubricated by Violet's calculated words. Griffin, reinvigorated by the promise of vindication, threw himself back into his work with renewed intensity. Wells, buoyed by Violet's faith in him, resolved to see the project through, if only to ensure it didn't spiral further into chaos. And Violet, ever watchful, continued to maneuver the two men like pieces on a chessboard. Each step brought her closer to her ultimate goal, perfection of the serum and the unimaginable rewards it promised. Griffin's vendetta, a gentleman's retribution. As Griffin bid Wells and Violet farewell, his demeanour was unusually calm. "A short break in London," he explained, "to clear my mind and step away from the laboratory chaos." He promised to return reinvigorated, ready to push the serum to its final perfected state. Wells encouraged the idea, relieved at the prospect of easing tensions. Violet, ever calculating, saw this as an opportunity to make adjustments to the lab in his absence and subtly refine her own plans. Yet Griffin had no intention of resting. The train to London felt like a purgatory between his two lives. As the landscape rushed past, Griffin's mind was ablaze with rage. Violet's words echoed in his head. "They'll grovel at your feet. They'll beg for the chance to attach their names to your genius." But mere grovelling wasn't enough. His detractors deserved punishment, swift and brutal. White's Gentlemen's Club, chaos among the elite. Griffin's first target was White's, a sanctuary of exclusivity and privilege. This was once his domain, a place where ideas were exchanged and reputations cemented. But those days were gone. His peers had turned on him, casting him out with scorn and ridicule. Under the cover of invisibility, Griffin slipped past the club's imposing doors, a ghost among the living. Inside, the smell of polished wood, fine brandy, and cigar smoke greeted him like an old adversary. He moved silently through the rooms, observing the men who had once been his equals, or so they believed. At the billiards table, Griffin began his games. He nudged a ball ever so slightly mid-shot, causing the player to curse loudly at the unexpected miss. As another member leaned in to light his cigar, Griffin blew out the flame of his match, leaving him fumbling with frustration. He tipped glasses of brandy as they were raised, causing rich amber liquid to stain pristine white shirts. The patrons grumbled in irritation, their confusion mounting. Griffin revelled in their discomfort, his grin growing with each small victory. The smoking room, a bloody reckoning. Griffin followed 3 of his former peers into a private smoking room. He recognised them immediately: Lord Alistair Barrington, Sir Neville Hawthorne, and Charles Pembroke. These were the men who had spearheaded his downfall, mocking his theories and ensuring his exile from their circles. The room was opulent, adorned with oil paintings and ornate furnishings. A young man had been summoned to entertain them, a symbol of their decadence. As they drank and indulged in debauchery, Griffin's disgust boiled over. He waited for his moment. When the men were thoroughly drunk, their laughter and self-congratulations grating on his ears, Griffin struck. The cutthroat razor felt familiar in his hand, an instrument of cold precision. He slashed Barrington's throat first, the blade slicing through flesh with a sickening ease. Blood sprayed across the room as the man gurgled and fell. Hawthorne and Pembroke leapt to their feet, their faces twisted in shock and terror. "What is this?" Pembroke screamed, his voice cracking. Griffin was relentless. He moved between them like a phantom, his blade finding its mark again and again. The room became a crimson tableau, the once luxurious decor drenched in gore. The young man stood frozen, his face a mask of horror. Griffin turned to him briefly, his bloody work complete, and whispered in his ear, "Tell them a demon did this." The boy fled, bursting into the main corridor of the club, his screams echoing through the halls. A demon spirit, invisible and deadly. Unseen and exhilarated, Griffin slipped out through a side corridor known only to members. The cold night air greeted him like an old friend as he walked back to his lodgings, his smile never wavering. The Theatre Royal, Drury Lane, an encore of violence. The following night, Griffin's bloodlust was far from sated. His next targets were old acquaintances he knew would be attending a performance at the Theatre Royal, Drury Lane. These men, seated in a private box, were enjoying the privileges of wealth and power with their escorts. Griffin slipped into the theatre unnoticed, the world of velvet curtains and hushed whispers his stage for another act of vengeance. From his vantage point, he watched them laughing and whispering to their companions, oblivious to the danger lurking just beyond their sight. When the performance began, Griffin made his move. He entered their box silently, the sound of the orchestra masking his approach. His razor gleamed in the dim light as he struck, his blade slicing through silk and flesh alike. The escorts screamed as blood spattered their gowns, their cries drowned by the music and applause of the audience. Griffin worked quickly, his movements precise and lethal. When the men lay lifeless, their once arrogant faces frozen in terror, Griffin whispered to the escorts, "Run! Tell them the invisible demon strikes again." Panic erupted in the theatre as the women fled, their screams alerting the audience to the horror that had unfolded. Griffin, unseen and triumphant, slipped out into the night, his heart pounding with exhilaration. A reinvigorated return, far from over. When Griffin returned to the laboratory the following day, his demeanour was markedly different. He greeted Wells and Violet with uncharacteristic warmth, his eyes alight with purpose. "I feel much better," he announced, rolling up his sleeves and diving back into his work. "Let's perfect this serum once and for all." Wells, unaware of the carnage in London, was pleased to see Griffin's renewed focus. Violet, however, sensed something darker in his newfound vigour. She resolved to keep a closer watch on him, knowing that whatever had transpired in London was far from over. Shadows of consequences. I won't protect you. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of Wells's study as he shuffled through the disarray on his desk. His brow furrowed in frustration as he moved papers, journals, and a still warm teacup. Where on earth is that blasted paper? He muttered. Violet's voice floated in from the doorway, calm and measured. Good morning, Herbert. Searching for something? Yes, he grumbled without looking up. My morning paper. It's vanished. Violet stepped into the room, carrying a clipboard and wearing a knowing smile that quickly faded. I wanted to speak with you about the lab. The new equipment arrived early this morning. Griffin's been inspecting it already. It seems things are finally moving in the right direction. Wells nodded absent-mindedly, still rifling through the papers. That's good news. Finally some progress. But where is that paper? Violet's expression changed, a flicker of tension crossing her face. Herbert, she began cautiously, perhaps we can discuss the paper later. There are more pressing matters. He stopped and looked at her, his sharp gaze narrowing. You know something. What is it? She hesitated, glancing at the armchair in the corner. Please sit. You're not going to like what I'm about to show you, but you must promise to remain calm. His irritation gave way to concern. Out with it, Violet. What's happened? Violet moved to the armchair and retrieved the folded newspaper from beneath the seat cushion. She placed it on his desk and stepped back, watching his face as he unfolded it. The headline screamed in bold letters, Demon Attack Turns London Gentlemen's Club and Theatre Royal into Bloodbath, 5 dead. Wells froze, his eyes scanning the text beneath the headline. The article described an invisible assailant who had wreaked havoc the previous night, leaving a trail of blood and terror in 2 prominent London establishments. Witnesses claimed they had heard mocking laughter and felt an unseen force strike them down. One man's hysterical account referred to a demon spirit. Wells's hands trembled as he placed the paper back on the desk. He looked up at Violet, his face a mask of fury. You knew. I suspected, she replied evenly. I needed time to consider how best to approach you with this. If I had told you outright, you'd have confronted Griffin without thinking. You removed it from my desk, he thundered. That makes you complicit. Are you sheltering him? Or worse, aiding him? Don't be absurd, Violet snapped, her own composure cracking. I've done nothing of the sort. But let's not pretend we're innocent here, Herbert. We've funded his work, given him a place to conduct his experiments. Do you think the authorities will see us as uninvolved? Her words landed like a punch, and Wells sank into his chair. His anger remained, but now it was tinged with fear. What are we going to do? Violet's tone softened, though her gaze remained steely. We confront him, but we must tread carefully. If we're too aggressive, we risk pushing him further into madness. Wells' voice was a low growl. We should go to the police. And tell them what? Violet countered. That an invisible man is terrorising London. That we've been helping him. Think, Herbert, they'd lock us up alongside him. Reluctantly, he nodded. Fine, but if he's gone too far, I won't protect him. Confronting the monster, you have no choice. Griffin was in the lab, meticulously assembling a device with newly arrived components. He seemed calm, even content, humming softly to himself. Wells entered first, with Violet close behind. The tension in the room was tangible. Wells didn't waste time. He tossed the newspaper onto the workbench. Care to explain this? Griffin glanced at the headline and smirked. A bit dramatic, don't you think? But I suppose that's the press for you. Dramatic? Wells shouted. 5 people are dead. Innocent people, Griffin. You've turned our work into a horror show. Griffin's smirk faded, replaced by cold detachment. Innocent? Hardly. Those men mocked me, dismissed me. They deserved what they got. Justice was served. Wells was livid, but Violet intervened. You can't justify this, Griffin. Your actions jeopardise everything we've worked for. If you continue down this path, you'll destroy us all. Griffin's gaze shifted to her, his expression unreadable. You sound like you're giving me an ultimatum, Violet. I don't respond well to threats. It's not a threat. It's a reality, she said firmly. You've forced our hand. From now on, there will be rules. Griffin's eyes narrowed. Rules? Wells stepped in, his voice steady but edged with steel. You'll be secured in a room every night, and you'll wear this. He held up a chain belt, fitted with 2 small bells. If you go invisible, at least we'll know where you are. Griffin laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. You think you can shackle me? Contain me? You're more foolish than I thought. You have no choice, Violet said, her tone icy. Either you agree or we go to the authorities. And don't think for a moment they won't believe us. We'll bring enough evidence to bury you. For a moment, Griffin said nothing, his gaze darting between them. Then, with a mocking bow, he said, Very well. Chain me up like a dog if it makes you feel safe. But remember this, you need me far more than I need you. The monster's resolve, smug satisfaction. Later that night, Griffin sat alone in his secured room, the chain belt uncomfortably tight around his waist. He stared into the darkness, his mind racing. They think they've won, he muttered to himself. But this is only the beginning. I've tasted power and no chain can hold ambition. A faint smile played on his lips as he leaned back against the wall. Let them have their illusions, for now. The following day, Griffin immersed himself in the continued refinement of the serum, tirelessly experimenting and meticulously noting every outcome. The lab was alive with the hum of equipment and the clinking of glassware. Violet, ever present, busied herself with tasks that seemed mundane but were, in reality, carefully calculated to keep her informed of Griffin's progress. She watched him intently, offering assistance when necessary and slipping in words of encouragement, her voice a soothing balm to Griffin's volatile temperament. Wells, however, was far from sharing their focus. He sat at his desk, quill in hand, ostensibly documenting the day's trials, but his mind refused to comply. The gruesome headlines of the previous day's newspaper haunted him. Demon attack turns London Gentlemen's Club and Theatre Royal into a bloodbath. 5 dead. The words were etched in his brain, each one a hammer blow to his moral compass. He could still see the article, the vivid descriptions of violence, the terrified accounts from witnesses, the speculation of an otherworldly assailant. Wells's attempts to distract himself were futile. Each time he tried to focus on the precise wording of his observations, his thoughts wandered back to Griffin. The scenes described in the paper, the senseless violence, the overwhelming carnage, were exactly the kind of vengeance Griffin had hinted at before. The thought made Wells's stomach churn. Violet, on the other hand, was thriving. She was quietly elated at their rapid progress. The serum's formulation was nearing perfection, its effects increasingly predictable and controllable. She imagined the possibilities, a larger pre-production laboratory, a state-of-the-art manufacturing facility, investors clamouring for a share in the miracle formulation. The wealth and power it would generate would dwarf her inherited estate, rendering it insignificant in comparison. But wealth was not Violet's only ambition. She envisioned a future where she held the exclusive key to invisibility, a weapon, a tool, an unparalleled advantage in any arena. She would not share it, not with Wells, not with Griffin. They were necessary now, but soon they would be expendable. As she moved about the lab, Violet's thoughts lingered on the delicate web she had woven. The animosity between Griffin and Wells was evident, simmering just beneath the surface. It wouldn't take much to bring it to a boil. Her brilliant cunning had enabled her to control the situation and the men within it. She had orchestrated their every move, ensuring they remained focused on the work while subtly stoking their mutual resentment. The balance was delicate, but Violet was confident in her ability to maintain it, at least until the time came to execute her final plans. She smiled inwardly, a faint, self-satisfied smirk. Her coup was inevitable. The pieces were aligning perfectly, and when the time came, she would discard Wells and Griffin like pawns in a game she had already won. For now, she would let them believe they were indispensable, vital to the project's success. Griffin, oblivious to Violet's schemes, continued his work with single-minded determination. He scribbled notes furiously, muttering to himself as he adjusted the delicate balance of the serum's components. His recent break had invigorated him. His focus on the serum was sharper than ever, driven by his own private goals of mastery and vindication. Violet watched him, her eyes narrowing as she calculated her next move. She knew Griffin's volatility could be both an asset and a liability. For now, she needed him stable, compliant, and productive. Once the serum was perfected, however, he would be more of a threat than an asset. Wells finally looked up from his notes, his brow furrowed. "Griffin," he called, his voice tense. "A moment of your time, if you please." Griffin glanced up, irritation flickering across his face. "What is it now, Wells? Another lecture on ethics?" "No, not ethics," Wells replied, though the word hung heavily in the air between them. "I'd like to discuss our timeline. Violet and I agree that we need to finalize the serum and proceed to more formalized testing. The distractions must stop." Griffin's eyes darkened, but Violet interjected smoothly. "He's right, Griffin, we're so close to something extraordinary. Let's keep our focus here where it matters most." Her voice was honeyed, soothing, yet firm enough to command attention. "The world will remember us for this. When the time comes, you'll get the recognition you deserve, beyond anything you've ever imagined." Griffin's scowl softened slightly as Violet's words took root. She had a way of speaking that made him feel invincible, almost godlike. He nodded curtly, returning his attention to the serum, but the tension in the room remained. Wells glanced at Violet, his unease unspoken but understood. She met his gaze with a reassuring smile, but behind it lay a calculated confidence. Everything was going according to plan. The following day, Griffin beavered away with the continued refinement of the serum, with Violet helping and busying herself around the lab. Wells, however, was in a less ebullient mood. His thoughts, despite his best attempts to focus on documenting all trials and happenings within the lab, kept wandering back to the newspaper article and the bloodbath in London. The horrifying details gnawed at him, making it difficult to concentrate. Violet, on the other hand, was pleased with the rapid rate of their progress. She was quietly confident that the serum's precise formulation would very soon be complete and ready for investment. She envisioned building a larger pre-production laboratory-based manufacturing facility, ensuring the process could scale up for high-volume serum production while maintaining consistent quality and effects on the user. Soon it would reach a point where she would no longer need Wells or Griffin. The miracle formulation would be hers alone to capitalize on, with no intention of sharing either the means of production or the unimaginable wealth it would generate. Though she had not yet finalized her plans to dispose of them both, she knew it was inevitable. She had carefully built the animosity and resentment between the two men to a simmering point. Her brilliance, true to her name Cunningham, enabled her to control both men and the situation. She smiled inwardly, savouring her anticipated coup. Although it was never mentioned or done in any overt way, Griffin sniggered at the fact that he was never left alone in the lab. From the moment he was released from his incarceration in the morning to the time he was secured again in the evening, either Violet or Wells or both were always present. Quite often he felt they were pretending to be busy with some important task just to justify their presence. They worked together, ate together. The only thing they didn't do together was sleep or attend to personal needs. It was later that evening, just before 9 o'clock, the agreed end of their working day, when Violet excused herself to retire to the powder room. Wells was seated at his desk, staring into space with a ponderous glazed look on his face. Seizing the moment, Griffin procured the items he required for his planned sortie that evening. He retrieved a small crowbar and sturdy screwdriver from the unpacking area and 2 new candles from the supplies cupboard. Placing them on the small shelf beneath his desk, he ensured they were well out of sight from Wells or Violet, should she return unexpectedly. Taking a vial of serum from his coat pocket, he carefully applied it to each item, watching with satisfaction as they turned invisible within seconds. He then slid them into his trouser pockets for safekeeping. When Violet returned, Griffin stretched and yawned loudly. Another wonderful day shared with you both in the lab, he said theatrically. He removed his lab coat, hung it on the stand, and raised his hands above his head, giving a little twirl for effect. The bells secured to the chain around his waist clanged and clunked with every move, a condition Wells had insisted on to ensure Griffin couldn't smuggle unapproved items into his cell. He stepped into his confinement area and turned to face them. "Don't forget to lock up, you never know who's about," he added with a sarcastic grin. Wells and Violet exchanged questioning glances. This was unusual. Normally, they had to coax Griffin to finish his work and enter his room. "Oh, one last thing," Griffin said, stopping short of the door. "Could I have a bowl of hot water? I'd like to soak my feet before retiring." Violet obliged, filling a large bowl with piping hot water from the laboratory geyser. Sliding it under the secured door, she locked and chained it. "There," she said. "Enjoy." "Oh, I will," Griffin replied with alacrity. "Sweet dreams," she said with a smirk, before turning to leave. Wells and Violet switched off all but one of the lab's lights, leaving the room subtly lit. Gothic shadows of the equipment stretched across the benches and floor. As the door latched behind them, Wells lingered for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he watched Griffin's uncharacteristic compliance. "Something's not right," Wells muttered as they stepped into the hallway. "He's too calm." "You're overthinking again," Violet replied with a dismissive wave. "Griffin knows he's beaten. He's just sulking, that's all this is." Wells shook his head but said nothing more. They headed to Wells's study for a nightcap and review the day's events, before retiring to their rooms for the night. Griffin moved to action. He retrieved the tools and candles from his pockets, now rendered invisible, and placed them on his desk. Kneeling by the bowl, he immersed the candles in the steaming water. As they softened to malleability, he worked quickly, moulding one into each of the small bells attached to his belt. Testing the modification, he did a little jig on the spot. The silence confirmed his success, and he smiled in smug satisfaction. The bells muted. Griffin sat back and waited, savouring the thrill of what the night might hold. This would be his first step in reclaiming control over his circumstances, and he intended to make the most of it. A trap set in shadows. I won't rest until it's all gone. Wells sat hunched over his desk, his pen motionless as he stared at the lines of his latest notes. Despite his best efforts to focus, his thoughts remained muddled, a storm of unease brewing within him. Griffin's sudden compliance earlier that evening played over in his mind, each moment pricking at his sense of caution. "I don't like it," he muttered, glancing over at Violet. She was lazily flicking through the society pages of yesterday's newspaper, not really taking anything in as her mind was also ruminating on Griffin's parting comments and change in behaviour. Closing the newspaper and savouring her Singapore sling, "He's never this cooperative. Something isn't right, he's playing a game, certainly," she admitted, "but he's overestimating his wit. Whatever he's planning, it won't work." "And if it does?" Wells's tone was grim, his unease unabated. She drained her glass. "Then we make sure it doesn't. If he wants to outsmart us, let him walk into his own undoing." Their eyes met in mutual understanding, and despite her arrogance, Violet's agreement gave Wells some reassurance. As the laboratory lights dimmed and the silence of the night settled in, Griffin sat in his cell, seemingly docile. The bells at his waist jingled faintly with each small shift of his body. He lounged against the wall, his head tilted back as if in surrender to the monotony of confinement. But his mind was far from idle. When the faint click of the door latch confirmed Wells and Violet had left, Griffin leaned forward with a predator's grin. From his pocket, he retrieved the screwdriver and crowbar, both invisible thanks to his earlier application of the serum. He moved to the top hinge of the cell door, carefully wedging the screwdriver between the hinge and the frame to bear the weight. With precision, he used the crowbar to lever out the hinge pin, the faint scrape of metal lost in the overbearing silence of the lab. Moments later, the lower hinge was dealt with in the same manner. Griffin placed both pins on his desk, their metallic glint lost in the darkness. With deliberate care, he lifted the heavy door, tilting it just enough to disengage the locks. The door swung silently, supported by its chain as he eased it open. Griffin stepped back, admiring his handiwork with a smug satisfaction. Freedom was within his grasp. Griffin moved like a shadow, his bell-silenced steps carrying him to the kitchen. There, tucked in its usual corner, was Wells's Parker V8 shotgun. Griffin handled it with reverence, checking the breech to confirm it was loaded. The old side-by-side bore the marks of wear, but at close range, it would do its job with brutal efficiency. He had considered using his trusted cutthroat razor but dismissed the idea. Wells, despite his scholarly demeanour, was an accomplished pugilist. And Violet? She was unnervingly adept in a fight. No, Griffin wanted the advantage of distance. He couldn't risk giving them any chance to retaliate. The faint moonlight filtered through the curtains of Wells's bedroom, casting fragmented shadows across the floor. Griffin crept inside, the shotgun cradled in his invisible hands. On the bed, Wells lay curled beneath the heavy sheets, his form shrouded but unmistakable. Griffin paused, savouring the moment. Wells, vulnerable and oblivious, was about to leave the world in the same fetal position as he had entered it, curled and helpless. He raised the shotgun, steadying it as he took aim. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," a voice whispered from the shadows. Griffin stiffened, the cold barrel of a revolver pressed firmly against his back. Violet stepped forward, her voice laced with a chilling confidence. "Say hello to Mr. Webley. Now, drop the Parker, slowly." Griffin hesitated, his mind racing. "You won't pull the trigger," he scoffed, though his voice betrayed a flicker of doubt. "And if you did, you'd probably miss, and highly unlikely," came Wells's voice from his right. Griffin turned sharply, his grip on the shotgun tightening, only to see Wells emerge from the shadows, an elaborately tooled Purdy shotgun aimed directly at him. "But if she did miss, I certainly won't." Griffin roared in frustration, spinning toward Violet. As the barrel of his shotgun swung, Wells moved with startling speed. He struck Griffin's head with the butt of his shotgun, the force of the blow sending the invisible man sprawling to the floor. The shotgun clattered from Griffin's grasp as his body crumpled against the carpet with a heavy thud. Griffin groaned as consciousness returned, and the cloak of invisibility faded, only to find himself bound in manacles. His head throbbed from the blow, and his vision swam as he was unceremoniously dragged back to the cell. Violet's grip on his arm was ironclad, and Wells followed closely behind, his expression a mix of relief and lingering anger. "I told you he was planning something," Wells muttered as they secured Griffin behind the newly reinforced cell door. Violet nodded, her earlier confidence now tempered with caution. "And we stopped him, for now, but he'll try again." "Then we'll be ready," Wells replied, his voice firm. As they turned to leave, Griffin's laugh echoed through the room, low and menacing. "You think this is over?" he sneered. "You've only delayed the inevitable." Violet glanced back, her expression unreadable. "Perhaps, but delays can be useful, Griffin. After all, they give us time to prepare for whatever's next, and thanks for the warning." "To be forewarned is to be forearmed," she said, a smile forming on her beautiful but tired face. Turning, she walked over to a bench and picked up a reagent bottle containing ether and a clean piece of linen cloth, both mostly used in the lab for cleaning equipment. However, it was most commonly used as an anaesthetic to render patients unconscious during surgery. As she approached the door, removing the ground glass stopper, with Wells looking on, she instructed him to reopen the cell. Between them, they would anaesthetise Mr. Griffin to both shut him up and eliminate any further chance of his escape. Wells complied with her request, a large smile of satisfaction showing on his lips. "Certainly, madam. After you." Griffin's smug expression rapidly changed to one of incredulity as he fought against the chains that restrained him so effectively. You can't do that to me. You're not a trained physician. I could die. Too much and I could asphyxiate. You'll be complicit in someone's death." As Violet held the ether-soaked cloth over his nose and mouth, she whispered, "Too late. We already are." Griffin's frantic struggles against the restraints grew weaker and weaker. Violet held the cloth firmly for a few moments until he slumped unconscious in the chair. Exiting the cell, they re-locked the chains, checking and double-checking the sturdy locks, which this time also secured the door's hinge pins. Standing there, they both paused, sighing heavily, venting some of their stress, anger, and to some extent, their fears. Wells glanced once again at Griffin, as if not fully trusting the anaesthetic, and then to Violet. This madness ends now, Violet. No more experiments, no more notes, no more serum. His voice was resolute, but beneath the surface the tremor of exhaustion and fear was evident. It's clear we've crossed a line no human should dare approach. Griffin's gone mad, and we'll follow if we keep going. Violet stood, arms folded, her face a mask of neutrality. You're right, Herbert, she said, her tone measured and calm. Griffin's descent into madness has proven we've gone too far. This project, it's cursed. Wells stopped pacing, turning to face her. Do you realise the blood that's on our hands, Violet? The horror Griffin unleashed on this city, those murders, that chaos, we made that possible. I made that possible. If I hadn't agreed to help him, this nightmare would never have happened. His voice broke and he turned away, staring at the shadowed walls of the lab. I regret every moment of it. Every single moment. Violet lowered her gaze, feigning sorrow. You're not alone, Herbert. I feel it too, the weight of it all. I can't stop thinking about that poor man in the clink, butchered in such a brutal fashion. Griffin wasn't always like this, was he? We couldn't have predicted he'd become this. She paused for a moment as if collecting herself, then added, But what's done is done. All we can do now is put an end to this nightmare and make sure it never happens again. Wells blinked, surprised by her compliance. So you agree? I do, she said, stepping closer. We'll destroy the lab, the serum, and the notes. But first, we need to deal with Griffin. He's unstable, dangerous. We can't let the authorities discover what he's done, or what we've done. It would ruin us both socially and financially. Wells nodded, relieved. I've been thinking about that. He needs professional help, a secure institution where he can be treated, discreetly. I'll arrange it. Violet placed a hand on his arm. A wise decision. And while you see to that, I'll start dismantling the lab and collecting the documentation. You know this work better than anyone else, but I'm more familiar with the technical aspects of Griffin's formulations. It'll go faster if I handle it. Wells hesitated. Fine. But when it's all ready, we'll destroy it together. I want to see everything, notes, vials, chemicals burned in the furnace. I won't rest until it's all gone. Violet offered a reassuring smile. Of course. We'll do this together. Violet's hidden agenda. There but for the grace of God. As soon as Wells left the lab to make arrangements for Griffin's relocation, Violet sprang into action. Her calm demeanour shifted to one of calculated efficiency. She rifled through Griffin's notes, pausing only to pocket the most vital pages. She carefully selected vials of the serum, wrapping them in cloth to protect them. She had planned for this eventuality. The secret laboratory she had commissioned weeks earlier was almost complete, a state-of-the-art facility far from prying eyes. Griffin's genius and obsession had brought the serum close to perfection, and she wouldn't let his insanity derail her ambitions. Poor Herbert, she muttered under her breath, smirking. So eager to burn away a legacy that could change the world. She worked quickly, packing all the notes, sample vials and critical equipment into a small wooden packing crate. She labelled it highly dangerous toxic with the return address of her secret laboratory, ensuring no suspicion would fall on her. Violet also discussed the return or sale of the more expensive equipment with Wells, framing it as a way to recover some of the funds she had invested. Since I financed this entire operation, I'd like to salvage whatever monies I can, she explained earnestly. I hope I have your blessing and full cooperation with this matter. Wells, distracted and preoccupied, nodded. Yes, of course. Do what you think best. Meanwhile, Wells was in his study, calling colleagues and contacts he hoped could arrange Griffin's relocation without arousing suspicion. The ordeal had aged him visibly. Dark circles under his eyes, his hair more dishevelled than usual. He paused, gazing out the window at the snow-dusted streets. "Griffin, if only you'd kept your sanity a little longer, you might have achieved wonders, but I guess it was not meant to be. There, but for the grace of God, go I." Confrontation in the lab. The nightmare ends tonight. When Wells returned to the lab later that evening, he found Violet standing by the furnace, a pile of documents and vials stacked neatly on a trolley. "I've gathered everything," she announced, her voice calm and confident. "The serum, the chemicals, the notes." Wells inspected the pile, his eyes narrowing. This is everything?" "Every last scrap," Violet lied smoothly. "The nightmare ends tonight." Wells opened the furnace door, the flames crackling hungrily. One by one they fed the papers and vials into the fire, watching as the flames consumed Griffin's life's work. Violet had substituted the contents of some of the vials with coloured water, and a few with a mixture of ether and water in equal measure, just for dramatic effect. This caused a series of small but notable minor explosions as the vials shattered in the furnace. As the last of the notes turned to ash, Wells sighed in relief. "It's done." Violet smiled faintly, trying her hardest not to glance at the crate at the far end of the lab. "Yes, Herbert, it's done." Some months later, Wells was seated in his study, the window open wide to let in the soothing sounds of summer. Birds chirped lazily in the hedgerows, and the faint hum of distant farm machinery working the land added a rhythmic undertone to the tranquil scene. The events of the preceding months played on his mind as he reflected on all that had transpired since the fateful day he had opened his door to a stranger, Dr. Griffin, a scientist who had sought his assistance. Wells chuckled softly, leaning back in his chair, a satisfied smile on his face as he drained the last of his brandy. The first draft of his forthcoming novel lay completed on his desk. He had considered a number of exotic and intriguing titles for the book, but had settled on the obvious, The Invisible Man. And tomorrow he would visit his publisher in London to discuss it. William Heinemann, who had published several of his earlier works, including The Time Machine and The Island of Dr. Moreau, had been intrigued when Wells outlined this latest story over dinner earlier in the year. Heinemann had expressed bewilderment, marvelling at how Wells conjured such vivid and fantastical ideas. If he didn't know any better, he had joked, he would think Wells actually had a time machine and had journeyed to distant futures to gather inspiration. They had both laughed at the notion, but Wells knew better. If only Heinemann knew the truth. His thoughts wandered briefly to the night when he and Violet had foiled Griffin's murderous intentions. Hidden in the shadows of his study, they had managed to survive what seemed an inevitable fate. A team of medics, aided by muscular orderlies, had arrived at Wells's home within hours of his frantic calls. Griffin had been subdued, sedated and bound in a leather restraint harness before being transported to a secure facility. Watching him being wheeled away had stirred a mix of pity and relief in Wells. He could not shake the guilt that gnawed at him for his complicity in their reckless scientific pursuits. How foolish they had all been. Wells hadn't seen Violet since the following day, when she had supervised the return of their equipment. Two solemn, scientist-like men had arrived in an unmarked vehicle, swiftly packing the crates under Violet's watchful eye. They exchanged few words, signed the necessary paperwork, and departed. At the time, Wells had harboured suspicions about Violet's motives, but now he considered those doubts unfounded, prudent perhaps, but misplaced. Shrugging, he tried to dismiss the memory. He returned to his desk, where a neat stack of manuscript pages waited. Tying them with a ribbon, he slipped them into a large pre-addressed manila envelope. He folded the flap and placed the envelope on the right side of the desk, next to his typewriter. Rising, he crossed the room to retrieve sealing wax, a candle, and matches from the old bureau. When he returned and sat down, he reached for the envelope. But it wasn't there. At least, not where he thought he had left it. He chuckled to himself and reached again, only to notice his glass of brandy was mysteriously full. A jolt of realization hit him. Pushing his chair back with a loud squeak, he spun toward the bureau and yanked open the drawer where he kept his service revolver. His hand grasped at emptiness. It wasn't there. Panic surged through him as he grabbed the ceremonial saber hanging on the wall nearby. He turned, brandishing the blade wildly, and shouted, Show yourself, Griffin! Don't hide like a coward behind your demonic shield of invisibility. Face me like a man! His eyes scanned the room, searching for any flicker of movement or distortion in the air. But there was nothing. That might be a little difficult, Herbert, considering. The voice startled him, and suddenly a form materialized before him. To his astonishment, it wasn't Griffin. It was Violet. "What are you? I thought," he stammered, lowering the saber slightly. "I thought it was Griffin. I feared he'd escaped from the asylum and had returned to finish the job. Sorry to disappoint you, Herbert." He tightened his grip on the saber, still pointing it at her chest. She raised an eyebrow. "You can lower that thing now. You won't be needing it, I assure you." He hesitated. "Your old Webley is in the other drawer. I moved it just in case." He slid his hand toward the other drawer and opened it slightly. The revolver lay there as she had said. Closing the drawer, he lowered the saber and sank back into his chair. "It would appear my initial suspicions of you were well-founded." She shrugged and took a seat opposite him. "Why are you here? I thought we had destroyed all the equipment, the research and the serum." She poured herself a measure of brandy from the crystal decanter on the drinks trolley. "May I?" she asked with a faint smile. "The same old Violet," Wells muttered. "Take what you want and then ask permission." "Old habits," she said with a warm smile. Wells's hands trembled slightly as he took another sip from his glass. "You didn't do as we agreed, did you? You've clearly developed the serum further. The transition between visibility and invisibility is almost instantaneous. What else have you improved, or is that it?" Smiling, she vanished instantly. Wells stiffened, glancing at the saber lying on the desk. Her glass of brandy lifted from the desk and tilted in mid-air, its contents vanishing as they reached her invisible lips. The glass returned to the desk, and as quickly as she had disappeared, she reappeared. "I have full control over when I transition between the two states," she said. "It's like a chameleon controlling its skin color. I just have to think it, and it happens. It took me a while to master it, but meditation techniques helped." Wells couldn't hide his amazement. "That's incredible," he admitted, though his tone held a wary edge. "So why are you here? You've obviously refined the formula far beyond what Griffin created. What do you want with me?" Her expression turned serious. "Griffin escaped earlier today." Wells sat up sharply. "When? How do you know?" "I have a contact there," she replied. "I've been monitoring his progress and his behavior as part of my research into the serum's long-term effects, and in case of such an event." "What happened?" "Apparently, he's been kept in solitary confinement for months, heavily sedated due to violent outbursts. This morning, he ripped off his restraints, killed 6 nurses, smashed through the security doors, and, according to eyewitnesses, disappeared." Wells stood, pacing the room. "You know he's coming for us, don't you?" "Yes," Violet said solemnly. "That's why I'm here." "But how are we supposed to defend ourselves against someone we can't see?" Wells demanded. "There's one advantage we have," Violet replied, "one I doubt Griffin is aware of." "Well, from where I'm standing, I can't see how we have any advantage over a psychotic murderer who can turn invisible at will. Just like you," Wells exclaimed. "They've been treating him with experimental antipsychotics," Violet explained. "I suspect these drugs have interacted with the monocaine serum in unforeseen ways, enhancing its effects." She took a step closer. "The serum, my version of it, enables me to see other invisible entities. It alters the visual cortex and neuroplasticity, allowing me to perceive wavelengths outside the visible spectrum. In short, I can see him." Wells stared at her. "Well, I suppose that's something. At least you'll be able to see him when he guts us with his razor. Most comforting." "This property is unique to my formulation," Violet continued. "Unless Griffin has developed a similar adaptation, he won't see us. We'll have the upper hand." "We? You're the one who's invisible." Violet pulled a syringe from her pocket. "I can't do this alone, Herbert. I need your help, just as you need mine."
Bloody Mary's Horror Stories. Watch, like, and subscribe.